We've got the panel together, the lovely ladies here for discussion on the topic of social economic story. And I guess we want to open it up to you guys if anyone's got questions. You've got the microphones there. I also encourage you to use the app for those who are tech savvy. In the meantime, we do have a question that's come forward to the panel. Tourists might like to see commercial fishers, but what about locals? Your thoughts, ladies?
I guess that's to our study. Yeah, we didn't... Do you remember whether we... Michelle, I'm asking Michelle, do you remember whether we broke that down, that question about whether it was locals saying that about... I mean, we could say from our interview studies that, yeah, support in the local community for fishing, it varied from community to community. Eden, it was really strong. The Clarence, it was really strong. Some places like the Central Coast, where there's been more of an influx of people from other places who don't have connections to the fishing industry, it was less strong, that sort of stuff. It varies a bit, but it can be very strong. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add is that that piece of work by Essence Communications certainly suggested an appetite for the general community, or the people surveyed at least, were interested in hearing more about the fishing industry. It was fishing industry in that case. And it wasn't necessarily more information. This is where we're getting into that storytelling role. They just were keen to see a more present fishing industry. That's not quite the same thing as looking at it from your local bay, but there is a desire, an appetite for more visibility.
Yeah. And actually, something that I should have mentioned earlier, one of the things that we produced, we aimed to try and, from our study, is produce some stories, and I brought along a few of the brochures that we produced that do tell stories, so you can circulate these and take them home. I need them back. To see, with this kind of work, how you can start to produce stories. This is just one way of doing it, but it's, with all that talk about stories this morning, I'm sure everyone's thinking about how you might do it, and this is one way.
Do you want to take the microphone?
Oh.
Okay, hi guys, thank you. Thanks, Tricia. Natalie Dowling from CSIRO. I am leading an FRDC project on triple bottom line harvest strategies in Queensland, and I'm very encouraged by the extent of the social and economic survey work that's been done. And is generating a lot of data and information. I'm also encouraged that there's been a lot of work around defining operational social objectives that can be measured. What I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on is how the outcomes from these social and economic surveys can translate to data that can inform measurable objectives that can be directly operationalised in a harvest strategy context.
Yeah, the stuff we produce, we produce some indicators, and the larger report shows the kinds of indicators, and some of those are measurable. I think it's probably a next step to take it to then start to be able to use those for the purposes of a triple bottom line harvest strategy, which is sort of more from a government perspective of thinking about how to best use resources for social benefit overall, whereas our question was more about how does this industry benefit these communities, and it wasn't weighing up costs and benefits, and it wasn't weighing up relative benefits between industries. So there's another step to take there. But I think the indicators we've come up with and the work we put into starting to measure those is something that could feed into that if you take it a bit further.
Well, I've got a question. You talked about engagement strategy. Emily, do you want to expand on that a bit more for us? We're all about doing here.
Sorry?
We're all about doing.
Yes, that's right. Well, I mean, just repeating those earlier points, that there is an interest in a greater visibility of fisheries and aquaculture, And I think part of the acknowledgement of using a common property resource is to be visible and demonstrate and be transparent about your use of that resource and the types of benefits that flow to the Australian public from that. But to engage can mean many, many things. So in our HDR sub-program, we use it to really describe, includes communication, but it includes, I suppose, activities that are two-way, that are more than simply informing or spitting out information, but are actually responsive to a set of interests that affected or interested communities or consumers have in your activity. And then it involves listening as a primary part of whatever that activity is. It involves action too. But the industry's been, I mean, in the last 5 years when I did this quick scan, it's been an extraordinary amount of activity and so many different sectors. I think at the sector level and at the peak body level, there's been just a really commendable level of searching for what's the right way to engage. And really that's why I tried to provide that scan of these critical issues and the basis for the conflicts, because how you engage really has to be reflective of whether you are a really large-scale industrial sector or whether you are a very small-scale, localised, distributed sector, and whether you are feeding Australian people or if you're exporting. Your engagement strategy has got to reflect those kinds of properties of your fishing industry. But at the same time, obviously, we need some really clear, basic, consistent messages, which is where it's fantastic to see SIA now in that position to do that. So we've had a history in the last 5 years of some strong engagement at the sector and product level, and then we also, now we're at the point where it's going to be how can those messages be consistently funnelled up to something that can be national. But having said all that, our industry loves to compare itself to other primary agri-food sectors, and I put in a real pitch for seafood fisheries and aquaculture being so complex that that's quite hard to do. We're not the same thing as the poultry or the egg industry. They've really only got one key issue on which their social licence rests. We are so complex. We have so many multiple levels of types of potential conflicts, but at the same time, there's a lot of resilience in that, in all of the different kind of ways in which fisheries and aquaculture are so embedded in the Australian culture. So the answer to engagement is it's complex, and it has to be sort of a bit contextualised and a bit bespoke, but at the same time, there's got to be those critical messages that we can be consistent and national about.
Richard Stevens from the Australian Fisheries Management Authority. Emily, I think you were the only one who mentioned journalists in your talk. Bearing in mind the repetitive 24-hour news cycle, shock jocks, television, print media, etc., what advice would you give to Seafood Industry Australia about the focus of their communication strategy?
Thank you, Richard. I'm not a communication specialist, but I did cite a bit of work by a PhD student, Coco Cullen-Knox, who's here, and she's actually investigating this phenomenon called the mediatisation of all of these debates. And it's really unpacking how far more influential than we probably have appreciated certain key media players are in the filtering of information and in the summing up of information that gets used by political advisors, procurers throughout. So I think, and it's used informally and formally, so in the conventional print media, etc., but also on social media. So we can't underestimate this. I mean, the average Australian person doesn't want to go and scan a whole heap of information and come up with their own position. They want to take it from influential influencers who've already mediated this information. So I think a really critical step's just working out who those key influencers are and what their sources, what their networks and sources of information are. I don't have a really clear response to how to respond to particularly sort of community outrage or some of those sensationalist claims, and the general standard response has been ignore it. But if it's absolute outright misinformation, do you? I mean, this is this whole post-truth issue, and I don't know that we know yet where it rests, but there is some research underway. It's a really critical one. It's not about information volume, or it's about how it's disseminated, what networks, who's listening, and then how they use that information to make a judgment about the industry.
Can I just add something to that?
Very quickly.
I think also too that whether it's an engagement strategy or or its associated communications plan. I just think we need a more discussion about who is it that we want what them to do and what do we want people to do? Who do we want to do what? Because I think we just have a kind of this larger conversation about that if we don't have social acceptability, it's bad, and we need to do something about it. So we pop up communication strategies or we come up with good messages. But what is it that we want who to do is really important part of it.
All right, we're going to leave it all there.